Hashtag the last meal. Part 1, the Christmas Eve that changed everything. The snow fell in thick curtains over the Heights neighborhood of Portland, Oregon. Each flake drifted down in silence, covering the cracked
This
sidewalks
feels
and
like a
rusted
dream.
chain link
The
fences,
best dream.
with a blanket
love
of
you.
white that made everything look clean, almost beautiful. The streetlights flickered in their uneven rhythm, some bright and steady, others barely holding on, casting long shadows across the narrow street. Christmas Eve, the most magical night of the year. But magic, Emma Carter had learned long ago, was expensive, and she was broke. She stood at the window of her tiny apartment, watching the world outside transform under the falling snow. Through the thin curtains, she could see into the homes across the street, families gathered around dinner tables, children laughing, trees decorated with lights that twinkled like stars. The warm glow of togetherness that seemed to exist everywhere except in her own small corner of the world. Emma turned away from the window and looked at what she had. One room, that was it. One room that served as kitchen, living room, and bedroom all at once. The walls were stained with patches of water damage from last winter's leak. The floor creaked in 3 different spots. But everything was clean. She made sure of that. The few clothes they owned were folded neatly on a makeshift shelf made from cinder blocks and plywood. The single bed she shared with her daughter was made with hospital corners. The threadbare blanket pulled tight. Dignity. When you had nothing else, you had dignity. On the small wooden table sat a plate. Emma stared at it for a long moment. Mashed potatoes made from a box that cost 99 cents. 2 small pieces of roasted chicken from the discount bin at the grocery store. A handful of peas that she'd carefully rationed from a frozen bag. That was it. That was everything. She had $8.47 left in her wallet. The rent was 2 months overdue. $1,300 that might as well have been $13 million. Mrs. Patterson, the landlord, had stopped knocking. That was somehow worse than the knocking. The silence meant the eviction notice was coming. Emma closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She could do this. She had done it before. She would feed Sophie first, make sure her daughter had a full stomach, and then she would eat whatever was left, if there was anything left. Come on, sweetie. Time for dinner. The small voice that answered came from the corner of the room where Sophie sat on the floor, playing with her only doll. The toy was old, a hand-me-down from the thrift store. One arm hung at an odd angle where the joint had broken. The dress was torn at the hem, carefully mended with mismatched thread. But Sophie loved that doll more than anything in the world. Can Rosie eat with us, Mama? Emma felt her heart crack just a little bit more. Of course she can. Sophie got up carefully, cradling the doll against her chest. She was 5 years old, with blonde hair that needed cutting and bright blue eyes that saw everything, felt everything. She wore pajamas that were 2 sizes too big, bought from the clearance rack last year. Her feet were bare because her only pair of shoes had holes in the soles, and Emma was saving them for school days. The little girl climbed onto the plastic chair, her feet swinging in the air, not quite reaching the floor. She set Rosie carefully on the table beside her plate, angling the doll so it could see the food. Merry Christmas, Mama. Merry Christmas, baby. Emma sat down across from her daughter, and for a moment, they just looked at each other. Sophie smiled, that gap-toothed smile that made Emma's chest hurt with how much she loved this child. This beautiful, perfect child who deserves so much more than a broken doll and a plate of food that barely qualified as a meal. Can I start? Yes, honey, it's all yours. Sophie picked up her fork with both small hands and poked at the mashed potatoes. She brought a tiny bite to her mouth and chewed slowly, deliberately, as if she were trying to make each taste last as long as possible. Emma watched her, unable to eat her own portion, unable to look away. Outside, the sounds of other families drifted through the thin walls. Laughter, music, the clinking of glasses and toasts. Somewhere down the hall, someone was playing Christmas carols. Silent night, holy night. All is calm, all is bright. Emma tried not to think about it, tried to focus on this moment right here with her daughter. Sophie was eating, Sophie was warm, Sophie was safe. That was all that mattered. Then Sophie stopped. Her fork hovered in the air, halfway towards her mouth. She turned her head toward the window, staring through the gap in the curtains at something outside. Emma followed her gaze. Across the street, sitting on the concrete steps of an abandoned house, was an elderly woman. She wore a coat that was far too thin for this weather, the fabric worn through at the elbows. Her shoulders shook, whether from cold or something else, Emma couldn't tell. The woman's hands were empty. No bemai, no belongings, nothing. She just sat there perfectly still, except for that trembling, staring down at the snow-covered ground. Mama. Emma's throat tightened. I see her, sweetie. She doesn't have any food. I know. She's all alone. Emma closed her eyes. She knew what was coming. She knew her daughter's heart, had watched it break open for every stray cat, every sad face, every person who seemed to need help. Sophie felt everything. She always had, even as a baby. When someone cried, she cried. When someone smiled, she smiled brighter. She carried the weight of the world in her 5-year-old chest. Sophie put down her fork. She climbed down from the chair, her small feet making soft sounds on the wooden floor. She picked up her plate, still mostly full, and walked over to her mother. Their eyes met, blue on blue. Mama, can we give her my food? The air left Emma's lungs. She looked at the plate in her daughter's hands, then at Sophie, then out the window at the woman who sat alone in the cold. No, she wanted to say no. She wanted to explain that they barely had anything themselves, that they couldn't afford to give away what little they possessed. She wanted to remind Sophie that they had skipped meals before, had gone to bed with empty stomachs more times than Emma could count. But when she looked into her daughter's eyes, she saw something that silenced every objection. Compassion. Pure, uncalculated, impossible compassion. Emma's hands trembled as she took the plate from Sophie's small fingers. Are you sure, baby? She needs it more than me. I still have you. The words hit Emma like a physical blow. She nodded, unable to speak, and watched as Sophie turned and walked to the door. The little girl struggled with the handle for a moment before managing to pull it open. Cold air rushed in, carrying flakes of snow that melted instantly on the worn floorboards. Sophie, wait, put your coat on. But Sophie was already stepping outside, moving carefully down the steps, her bare feet leaving small prints in the fresh snow. She held the plate with both hands, steadying it, making sure nothing spilled. Emma grabbed her own thin sweater and followed, standing in the doorway, watching her daughter cross the empty street. The snow fell harder now, clinging to Sophie's blonde hair, turning it white. But the little girl didn't seem to notice the cold. She just kept walking, focused entirely on the woman ahead of her. The elderly woman looked up as Sophie approached. Her face was weathered, lined with years of hardship. Her eyes were red, whether from crying or from the cold wind, Emma couldn't tell. She stared at the little girl in front of her as if she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. Sophie stopped a few feet away and held out the plate. Her voice was small but clear in the quiet night. This is for you. Merry Christmas. The woman's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked at the food, then at Sophie, then back at the food. Her hands shook as she reached out to take the plate. Oh my God. Thank you, child. Thank you. Tears ran down the woman's face, cutting tracks through the dirt and grime. She held the plate as if it were made of gold, as if it were the most precious thing she had ever touched. Sophie stood there for another moment, just watching, making sure the woman was okay. Then she nodded, satisfied, and turned to run back home. Emma was still standing in the doorway. She opened her arms, and Sophie ran into them, her small body ice cold. Emma pulled her inside and shut the door against the winter night. She knelt down and brushed the wet snow from her daughter's hair. You are incredible, you know that? She was hungry, Mama. I know, but so were you. Sophie looked up at her mother with those two wise eyes. I still have you. That's more than she has. Emma pulled her daughter into a tight embrace. She felt the warm little body against hers and let herself cry. Just for a moment, just for the space of a few heartbeats. These weren't tears of sadness. They were something else. Pride, maybe. Or love. Or both things mixed together in a way that had no name. When she finally let go, she stood and went to the table. She picked up her own plate, the one she had intended to eat after Sophie finished, and brought it back. She sat on the floor with her daughter, and they split the food between them, eating slowly, making it last. Outside, across the street, the elderly woman ate too. Each bite was slow, deliberate, savored. Each bite was a miracle. And across the street, sitting alone in a black Mercedes that cost more than most houses, William Montgomery watched it all. He hadn't planned to be here. He had no destination in mind when he left his mansion in the West Hills. He just drove, trying to escape the suffocating silence of 12 empty rooms decorated by a professional who charged $15,000 to make everything look like a magazine spread. Everything perfect, everything lifeless. Will had spent Christmas alone for the 5th year in a row. No family, no friends, just him and a bottle of Macallan 25 that he hadn't even bothered to open. What was the point? Drinking alone was just another way of being alone. So he had gotten in his car and driven with no plan, no direction, just a desperate need to be anywhere other than that house. He ended up here, in the Heights, a neighborhood he would never normally visit. a neighborhood that existed in a different world from his own. He was about to leave when he saw the little girl come out of the house. At first he frowned. Who let a child out in this weather? Where was her coat? Her shoes? But then he saw what she was carrying, the plate of food, and he understood. Will sat frozen behind the steering wheel, watching as the scene unfolded. The little girl walking barefoot through the snow, the elderly woman's shocked face, the exchange of the plate, the smile on the child's face as she ran back home. Something inside Will cracked. It was like glass breaking in slow motion. No sound, but he felt every splinter, every sharp edge cutting into something deep inside his chest. That little girl had just given away her dinner, and she was smiling. When was the last time he had done something like that? When was the last time he had given anything without expecting something in return? When was the last time he had felt anything real at all? Never. The answer came quick and cruel. Never. Will rested his head on the steering wheel. His hands gripped it tight enough that his knuckles turned white. He was 42 years old. He had built an empire from nothing. He had a net worth that put him in the top 1% of the top 1%. He could buy anything, go anywhere, do anything. But he couldn't remember the last time he had smiled like that little girl smiled. With pure joy, with the knowledge that she had done something good, something right, something that mattered. He had everything, and he had nothing. Will sat there for a long time watching the simple house with its dim light. The little girl had gone back inside. The elderly woman ate slowly, reverently, as if each bite were a gift. And Will remained in his expensive car, trapped in that moment, unable to look away. How long he stayed, he couldn't say. But when he finally started the engine and drove away, something had changed. He didn't know what, couldn't name it, but he felt it, heavy and uncomfortable in his chest. The image of that little girl stayed with him, burned into his mind, the way she walked through the snow without hesitation, the way she held out that plate, the way she smiled. She gave what she had, and she smiled. The words echoed in his head all the way home. When Will finally pulled into a circular driveway, past the fountain that cost $60,000 and the landscaping that required a team of 5 gardeners, he sat in the car for another 10 minutes. His house loomed above him, 10,000 square feet of empty space, 20-foot ceilings, imported marble, custom everything. Cold, all of it was cold. He went inside and tried to sleep, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw that smile. He heard the silence of the street. He felt the cold that little girl must have felt, walking barefoot in the snow. She gave what she had, and she smiled. At 3 in the morning, Will got up. He went to his study and sat at his desk. He opened his laptop and typed into the search bar, "Bakery near me, open early." He would go back. He had to go back. He didn't know what he would say, what he would do. But he couldn't just let it end there. That little girl had changed something in him, cracked open something he thought had died years ago. She had reminded him what it felt like to be human. Morning came cold and bright. The snow had stopped during the night, leaving everything covered in white. The sun rose slowly, turning the sky pink and gold. It was Christmas morning. Will stood outside a small toy shop on the edge of the heights, waiting for it to open. He had been there since 6 in the morning, pacing back and forth, his breath making clouds in the frozen air. At 7, the owner finally unlocked the door, giving Will a strange look as he rushed inside. The shop was small and cluttered, filled with toys that were nothing like the high-end brands sold in the boutiques downtown. These were simple things: plastic cars, deflated balls, a few dolls lined up on a dusty shelf. Will walked to the dolls and stopped. There were 5 of them, all cheap, probably manufactured overseas for a few dollars each. But one caught his eye. She had brown hair and a blue dress. Her eyes were painted on, a little crooked. But there was something about her, something real. "How much?" Will pointed at the doll. The shop owner, a short man with a gray mustache, looked up from his newspaper. $15. Will pulled out his wallet and handed over a $50 bill. The man made change and wrapped the doll in brown paper, taping it carefully. Will took the package and left. He got back in his car and drove to the house where the little girl lived. His hands were shaking. He didn't know why. He had negotiated million-dollar deals without breaking a sweat. But this simple act of giving a doll to a child terrified him. What if they didn't want it? What if they thought he was some creep? What if he ruined everything? But he kept driving. And when he parked across the street from that small house, he sat there for a long moment, staring at the wrapped package in his hands. Through the window, he could see movement. The little girl was in the small backyard, sitting on a wooden crate, playing with her broken doll. She was making voices, telling stories, completely absorbed in her imaginary world. Will got out of the car. He crossed the street. He stood at the low fence that separated the yard from the sidewalk. The little girl looked up. She saw him standing there, and she didn't look scared, just curious. Hi. Will's throat was dry. Hi. Sophie tilted her head to one side. You're the man from the car, from last night. Will blinked. She had seen him. He thought he had been hidden in the darkness. But she had seen him. Yes, that was me. You saw me give the lady food? I did. Sophie smiled. It wasn't a proud smile, it was just a smile. Simple, honest. She was hungry, but now she's better. Will stood there holding the package, not knowing what to say. Then the door of the house opened, and a woman came out. The mother. She was young, maybe late 20s, with blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail. Her clothes were worn, but clean, and her eyes, the same bright blue as her daughter's, were filled with immediate suspicion. Sophie, come here. But Mama, I'm playing. Sophie, now. The little girl sighed but obeyed. She stood up, still holding her broken doll, and walked to her mother's side. The woman pulled her daughter behind her protectively, never taking her eyes off Will. Can I help you? The voice was polite but cold. Will understood, a single mother protecting her child from a stranger. He couldn't blame her. I'm sorry to show up like this. I saw what your daughter did last night. The woman didn't respond. She just waited. Will held out the package. This is for her, for what she did. Sophie peeked out from behind her mother, looking at the wrapped package with wide eyes. But her mother's hand on her shoulder held her in place. We don't need anything. Will lowered the package slightly, but didn't put it away. I know, this isn't about need, it's about what she did. She gave her dinner to someone who was starving. I just wanted to return the kindness. Emma studied his face. She looked for signs of dishonesty, of bad intentions, but all she saw was sadness, deep, bone-tired sadness. We don't know you. I know, I'm sorry. I don't mean to intrude. I just wanted to give this to her and leave. There was a long silence. The wind blew softly, swaying the bare branches of a tree in the yard. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked. Then Sophie slipped, free from her mother's grip, and walked to the fence. Emma started to stop her, but something held her back. Is that for me? Will nodded. He held out the package again, and this time Sophie took it. She looked back at her mother, asking permission with her eyes. Emma sighed, but didn't stop her. Sophie carefully unwrapped the brown paper, pulling at the tape slowly. The paper fell away, and she saw the doll. Brown hair, blue dress, eyes that caught the morning light and seemed to sparkle. Sophie's eyes went wide. She's beautiful. She held the new doll in one hand and her old doll, Rosie, in the other. She looked at both of them, comparing them. Then she smiled. Now Rosie has a friend. Will felt something twist in his chest. He had thought she would throw the old doll away, replace it with the new one. But she didn't do that. She just made room for both. Emma stepped closer, still cautious but softer now. Thank you. You didn't have to do that. I know, but I wanted to. Why? Will looked at Sophie, who was now making the two dolls talk to each other, creating a story where they were meeting for the first time. Because she reminded me of something I forgot. What's that? That there are still good people in the world. Emma crossed her arms. It wasn't hostility. It was protection. A habit. Well, thank you. That was kind of you. Will nodded. He knew it was time to leave. He had done what he came to do. There was no reason to stay. But he didn't want to go. Not because he wanted something from them, but because standing there in that small yard with that little girl playing and her mother watching over her, he felt something he hadn't felt in 20 years. Peace. But he turned to leave anyway. Have a good day. You too. Will started walking back to his car. He took 3 steps, maybe 4, his hands in his pockets, his heart beating strangely in his chest. Sir. He stopped, turned around. Sophie was at the fence, holding both dolls. Thank you. Will smiled. It was small but real. You're welcome. He walked to his car and got in. He sat there for a moment looking in the rearview mirror. Sophie was still in the yard playing. Emma was beside her now, saying something. The girl waved her new doll, laughing. Will started the car, but as he drove away, he felt that shift again. That change. It wasn't huge, it wasn't obvious, but it was there, undeniable and real. That little girl had given her dinner away. Today, he had given a doll. It wasn't the same thing. He knew that, but it was something. It was a start. And for the first time in many years, Will Montgomery felt like maybe there was still time. Time to be better. Time to feel again. Time to live something beyond the emptiness he had built around himself. He didn't know if he would see them again. Part of him said he shouldn't. He had done his good deed. He should let them be. But another part of him, the part that had been silent for so long it had almost died, whispered something different. Go back. 3 days later, Will did. Hashtag the last meal. Part 2, building bridges and facing storms. 2 months passed like water through cupped hands. January turned to February, and the snow that had blanketed Portland on Christmas Eve gave way to the cold rain that the city was famous for. The sky stayed gray most days, a heavy blanket of clouds that seemed to press down on everything below. But inside the small apartment in the Heights, something had changed. Something had grown. Will came to visit 3 times a week, Tuesday evenings, Friday afternoons, Sunday mornings. He never came empty-handed, though Emma had made it clear she wouldn't accept anything expensive. So he brought small things, a bag of groceries, a coloring book for Sophie, a thermos of good coffee from the shop near his office. At first, Emma had been suspicious, waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for him to ask for something in return. But the ask never came. He just showed up, sat at their small table, and talked. Or didn't talk. Sometimes they just existed together in comfortable silence while Sophie played on the floor. Will learned the rhythm of their lives. He learned that Emma worked the night shift at a fast food restaurant 6 days a week, coming home at 3 in the morning, smelling like fryer oil and exhaustion. He learned that Sophie went to kindergarten at the elementary school 4 blocks away, and that Emma walked her there and back no matter the weather because the school bus cost extra. He learned that they ate a lot of pasta and rice, that the heat in the apartment only worked sometimes, and that Emma had a pride as fierce as any he had ever encountered. She never asked him for money, never hinted, never made him feel like his wealth was the reason he was welcome there. And slowly, without quite realizing when it happened, Will began to feel something he hadn't felt since he was a child. He felt like he belonged somewhere. It was a Sunday morning in late February when Sophie asked the question that would change everything. They were sitting on the floor together, Will and Sophie working on a jigsaw puzzle. It was a simple one, only 50 pieces, showing a picture of a farm with a red barn and some cows. Sophie was determined to finish it without help, though she kept trying to force pieces into spots where they clearly didn't fit. Will sat beside her, patient, occasionally offering a gentle suggestion that she almost never took. Emma was in the kitchen area making pancakes from a box mix. The apartment smelled like butter and vanilla. Outside, rain tapped against the window in a steady rhythm. Why don't you stay here, Mr. Will? Will looked up from the puzzle. What do you mean, sweetheart? Sophie didn't look at him. She was focused on trying to jam a piece of sky into what was obviously part of the barn. You always leave. You go back to your house. Why don't you just stay here with us? Sophie, Emma's voice held a warning. Will felt something catch in his throat. My house is very big, Sophie. I have to take care of it. But you're always sad when you leave. Sophie finally looked up at him, those blue eyes seeing right through him. I can tell. Your eyes get different. Will opened his mouth to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. Because she was right. He was sad when he left. Every single time. Going back to that empty mansion felt like walking into a tomb. Beautiful. Expensive. Dead. I guess I am a little sad. Then stay here. Sophie said it so simply, as if it were the most obvious solution in the world. We have room. You can sleep on the floor. I do it sometimes when Mama lets me make a fort. Emma turned from the stove, spatula in hand. Sophie, Mr. Will has his own home. He can't just move in here. But he's lonely, Mama. Like that lady I gave the food to. He needs a family. The words hit Will like a physical blow. He looked at this 5-year-old child who saw the world with such clarity, such compassion, and he felt his carefully constructed walls crumble a little more. Emma came over and knelt beside her daughter. Sweetie, it's very kind of you to think of Mr. Will. But grown-ups have complicated lives. He has responsibilities. A job. He can't just leave all that behind. Sophie looked unconvinced. But he could visit every day instead of 3 times a week. That would be better, right? Will found himself smiling despite the ache in his chest. That would be much better. But your mama's right. I have things I need to take care of. Okay, Sophie returned to her puzzle. The matter settled in her child's mind. But you should come for dinner tonight. Mama's making her special spaghetti. Will looked at Emma, who shrugged with a small smile. It's just spaghetti with meat sauce. Nothing special. But you're welcome to stay if you want. I'd like that. And he did stay. He sat at their small table and ate spaghetti from mismatched plates, and it was the best meal he'd had in years. Not because of the food, though Emma's cooking was better than anything his private chef had ever made, but because of the company, because of the laughter, because Sophie told elaborate stories about her day at school, and Emma listened with such attention, such love, that Will felt like he was watching something sacred. This was what a family looked like. This was what he had missed his entire life. After dinner, after Sophie had been put to bed in the corner of the room with a makeshift curtain for privacy, Emma and Will sat together in the dim light of the single lamp. "Thank you for being so good to her." Emma's voice was soft. "She doesn't understand that people usually don't just show up in your life and stay. Everyone we've ever known has left eventually. I'm not going anywhere." Emma looked at him, really looked at him, and Will held her gaze. "You don't have to keep coming here, you know. I'm sure you have better things to do than spend time in a tiny apartment in the Heights. There's nowhere I'd rather be." The truth of the words hung in the air between them. Emma looked away first, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her worn sweater. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why us? You could help anyone. Donate to any charity. Why a broke single mom and her kid?" Will was quiet for a long moment, trying to find the right words. "Because when I was Sophie's age, there was a woman who took care of me. Her name was Maria. She was our cook. My parents were never around. My father was always working. My mother was always at some party or charity event. But Maria, she was there. She made me breakfast every morning. She let me help in the kitchen. She actually talked to me like I mattered." "What happened to her?" "When I was 10, she got sick. Cancer. My father fired her because he said we couldn't afford to keep an employee who couldn't work." Will's voice went flat, emotionless, the way it always did when he talked about his father. "I never saw her again. I asked, I begged, but they wouldn't tell me where she went. 3 months later, I heard one of the other staff mention that she had died." Emma's hand moved across the table, covering his. "I'm so sorry. I spent the next 30 years building walls." Will looked down at their hands, hers so small in his. "I told myself I didn't need anyone, that caring about people just led to pain. I married a woman I didn't love because it made business sense. I made millions of dollars and lost every relationship that ever mattered. And then I saw your daughter give away her last meal to a stranger, and something broke open inside me." He looked up, meeting Emma's eyes. "You and Sophie, you're not a charity case to me. You're the first real thing I've felt in decades." Emma's eyes were wet. "We're a mess, Will. I'm barely keeping us afloat. I work a job I hate for minimum wage. I can't even afford to buy my daughter new shoes. How can we possibly give you anything worth having? You give me a reason to wake up in the morning." The words hung in the air, raw and honest. Emma squeezed his hand and they sat like that for a long time, not speaking, just holding on. The following Tuesday, Will's carefully constructed world began to fall apart. He was in his office at Montgomery Holdings, a corner suite on the 30th floor with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The office was all glass and steel, modern and cold, decorated by the same designer who had done his house. Everything perfect, everything meaningless. Will was reviewing contracts when his office door opened without a knock. Richard Sterling walked in, carrying a manila folder and wearing an expression that Will had learned to dread over their 15 years of working together. Richard was 55, impeccably dressed, with silver hair and the kind of face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He had been Will's CFO since the beginning, had helped build Montgomery Holdings from a single property investment into a $200 million empire. He was brilliant with numbers, ruthless in negotiations, and he had never approved of anything that couldn't be quantified on a spreadsheet. "We need to talk." Richard sat down without being invited. "About your new hobby." Will set down his pen. "I don't know what you're talking about." Richard opened the folder and pulled out a stack of papers. He laid them on Will's desk one by one. Bank statements, transaction records, $5,000 transferred on the 15th of each month for the past 2 months. To Emma Carter. Will's jaw tightened. "You're having me followed? I'm protecting your assets. That's my job." Richard leaned back in his chair. "So who is she? This Emma Carter? Another gold digger like Victoria?" "Don't." Will's voice went cold. "Don't compare them." Richard pulled out another paper. "A background check. I already did my research. Emma Carter, 28 years old, single mother, high school dropout, works night shift at a fast food joint, no assets, $4,000 in debt, and you're sending her $5,000 a month." "I'm helping a friend." "A friend?" Richard's laugh was harsh. "Will, I've known you for 15 years. You don't have friends, you have business associates. So what is she really? Your mistress? She's a good person who needs help." Richard pulled out a photograph. It was grainy, taken from a distance, but clear enough. Will sitting at Emma's table, laughing at something Sophie had said. Another photo. Will and Sophie in the backyard, drawing with sidewalk chalk. "This looks like more than charity, Will. What I do with my money is my business, not when it puts the company at risk." Richard gathered the papers back into the folder. Do you have any idea how this looks? The CEO of a major real estate company spending time in the worst neighborhood in Portland, giving money to some waitress with a kid. The board would have a field day. I don't care what the board thinks. Well, you should. Richard stood up. Because I'm giving you an ultimatum. End whatever this is with Emma Carter, or I go to the board. I'll freeze your personal accounts. I'll call an emergency meeting. I'll do whatever it takes to protect this company from your midlife crisis. Will stood as well, his hands flat on the desk. You're threatening me. I'm trying to save you from yourself. Richard's voice was almost gentle. Will, I watched Victoria take 40 million from you in the divorce. I watched her play you, use you, and walk away laughing. I won't let it happen again. Emma is nothing like Victoria. That's what you said about Victoria before you married her. Richard moved toward the door. You have 48 hours to end it, or I will. The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. Will stood there for a long moment, staring at nothing. Then he swept his arm across the desk, sending contracts and papers flying. His coffee mug shattered against the wall, but the rage faded as quickly as it had come, leaving only a hollow ache. That night, Will sat alone in his mansion. The house was dark except for a single lamp in the living room. The ceiling stretched 20 feet above him. The furniture had cost more than most people made in a year. But he could have been sitting in a cardboard box for all the comfort it provided. He thought about Richard's ultimatum, 48 hours, end it or lose everything. Everything. What did that even mean? The company? He had built Montgomery Holdings from nothing, yes. But for what? To prove to his dead father that he was worth something? To fill the emptiness with numbers in a bank account? He thought about Emma and Sophie. The way Sophie's face lit up when he arrived. The way Emma laughed at his terrible jokes. The way it felt to sit at their table and eat simple food and talk about nothing important. That was worth something. That was worth more than all the money in the world. Will pulled out his phone. He called his personal lawyer, a man who had worked for him for 10 years and never asked questions. David, I need you to draft termination papers. For Richard Sterling. There was a pause. Will, are you sure? Richard's been with you since the beginning. I'm sure. And I need something else. Set up a trust fund, $500,000. Beneficiary is Emma Carter. She can't access it directly, but it can be used for living expenses, medical bills, education for her daughter. Will, what's going on? Just do it, please. Will hung up before the lawyer could ask more questions. Then he sat in the darkness and thought about what he was about to do. Richard was right about one thing. This was going to change everything. The next morning, Will showed up at Emma's apartment earlier than usual. It was barely 7. Sophie was still asleep behind the curtain. Emma answered the door in her pajamas, her hair messy, eyes still heavy with sleep. Will, what's wrong? I need to talk to you. Emma let him in, suddenly alert, worry creasing her forehead. Did something happen? Will sat at the small table and Emma sat across from him. Through the window, the morning light was just starting to break through the clouds, painting everything in shades of gray and gold. I want to open a restaurant, and I want you to run it. Emma stared at him. What? Will pulled out a folder he had brought with him. Inside were papers he had been working on all night. A business plan, lease agreements, permits. I want to open a restaurant that serves the kind of food you make. Comfort food, hun. The kind that makes people feel like they're home. And I want you to be the chef. Emma shook her head. Will, I can't. I'm not a chef. I just know how to make basic meals. Your food is amazing. I've tasted it. Sophie's tasted it. You cook with something that can't be taught. You cook with love. That's not how restaurants work. It's exactly how the best restaurants work. Will opened the folder and showed her the papers. I found a space in the Pearl District. It's small, only 1,500 square feet, but it's perfect. I can cover the lease for the first year. We'll need about $80,000 for renovations, $50,000 for equipment, and $70,000 for operating capital. Emma's eyes went wide. That's $200,000. I have it. Will, if this fails, you'll lose everything. I won't, because you won't let it fail. Will reached across the table and took her hands. Emma, I've spent my whole life building things that don't matter. Buildings, investments. A company that will exist long after I'm gone, but won't remember my name. I want to build something real. Something that matters. And I want to do it with you. Emma pulled her hands back, standing up, pacing the small room. This is crazy. You barely know me. What if I can't do it? What if I'm terrible at running a business? Then we'll figure it out together. We? Emma turned to face him. Why would you risk this? Your money, your reputation, everything? For what? Will stood as well. Because 2 months ago, I watched your daughter give away her last meal, and I realized I had spent 42 years accumulating wealth and I had never once done anything that generous. I want to be better. And you and Sophie make me want to be better. Tears ran down Emma's cheeks. I'm scared. I know. Me too. We'll move closer. But I'm more scared of going back to my empty house and living the rest of my life wondering what if. What if I had taken the chance? What if I had done something that mattered? What about your company? You're bored? Richard said you had responsibilities. How did you know about Richard? Emma wiped her eyes. I'm not stupid, Will. I know someone like you doesn't just show up in a neighborhood like this without people asking questions. I figured someone was watching. I fired Richard this morning. Emma's eyes went wide. What? He gave me an ultimatum. You or the company. Will smiled, and it was the freest he had felt in years. I chose you. The sound that came from Emma was half laugh, half sob. She covered her mouth with her hands. You're insane. Probably. Will pulled out another paper. This is a partnership agreement, 60-40 split. You get 60% because you'll be doing the real work. I'm just providing capital. 60%? Emma took the paper with shaking hands. Well, that's not fair to you. Fair would be you getting 100%, but I need to keep some stake in it so the tax structure works. He was lying. He didn't care about the tax structure, but he knew Emma's pride wouldn't let her accept everything. Emma read through the agreement. Her hands trembled. Tears dropped onto the paper, making the ink blur. What would we call it? Will pulled out one more paper. A mock-up of a logo he had paid a designer to create overnight. A simple drawing of a kitchen with warmth radiating from it. And above it, the name. Maria's Kitchen. Emma looked up at him, confused. Who's Maria? The woman who raised me when my parents wouldn't. The woman who taught me that food made with love is the only kind worth eating. Will's voice cracked. She died 32 years ago, and I never got to thank her. This would be how I thank her. Emma set down the papers and walked to a small shelf in the corner of the room. She picked up a photograph in a battered frame and brought it back to Will. The photo was old, the colors faded. It showed a woman in her 50s, standing in a large kitchen. She wore an apron covered in flowers. Her dark hair was pulled back in a bun. She was holding a wooden spoon and smiling at the camera. Will's hands shook as he took the frame. His vision went blurry. That's her. That's Maria. Emma's voice was barely a whisper. That's my mother. The world stopped. Will looked from the photo to Emma and back again. What? Her name was Maria Williams. She worked as a cook for a rich family in the West Hills. She told me about a little boy she took care of, how lonely he was, how she wished she could have done more for him. Will couldn't breathe. Your mother was Maria. She talked about you until the day she died. Emma sat down heavily. She never said your name, but she talked about the boy with sad eyes who needed someone to love him. She said it broke her heart when they fired her, because she knew you'd be alone again. I looked for her. Will's voice broke. After my father died, when I was 18, I tried to find her, but she was already gone. She died when I was 10. Emma took the photo back, looking at her mother's face. I learned to cook from her. Every recipe I make is hers. The cookies. Will remembered. That first day, the cookies you gave me tasted exactly like the ones she used to make, because they were hers. Emma set the photo on the table between them. She left me her recipe book. It's the only thing I have of hers. They sat in silence, both looking at the photograph. Maria Williams smiled back at them from across the years, from beyond death, bringing them together. Finally, Sophie's small voice came from behind the curtain. Mama, is Mr. Will here? Emma wiped her eyes quickly. Yes, baby, come out. Sophie emerged, rubbing sleep from her eyes, her hair sticking up in every direction. She saw Will and smiled that gap-toothed smile that made everything better. Did you bring breakfast? Something better. Will held out his hand to her. How would you like to help your mama and me build something special? What kind of special? A restaurant, where your mama can cook for lots of people, and you can help design the menu. Sophie's eyes went wide, like a real restaurant. Like a real restaurant. Sophie looked at her mother. Can we, Mama? Emma looked at her daughter, then at Will, then at the photograph of her mother smiling from that distant kitchen. Yes, her voice was stronger now. Yes, we can. Will stood and held out his hand. Emma took it, and in that moment, everything changed. 4 months of chaos followed. The space Will had found was perfect in theory. In reality, it was a disaster. The floors were warped. The plumbing was shot. The previous tenant had been a vintage clothing store that had gone out of business, and they had left everything behind. Racks of musty clothes, broken mannequins, a smell that seemed to have seeped into the very walls. But Emma saw past all of that. She walked through the space with a light in her eyes that Will had never seen before. The kitchen will go here. She pointed to the back corner. We'll need industrial appliances. a 6-burner stove, a walk-in refrigerator, and here this can be the dining area. Nothing fancy, just tables where people can sit and feel comfortable. They hired contractors. The first one took their deposit and disappeared. The second one did shoddy work that failed inspection. The third one finally did it right, but it cost an extra $15,000 and pushed them 3 weeks behind schedule. Emma threw herself into every detail. She designed the menu, writing and rewriting it dozens of times. She tested recipes in her tiny apartment kitchen, bringing samples for Will to try. She chose paint colors, light fixtures, the pattern for the tablecloths. And slowly, impossibly, it started to come together. Sophie helped where she could. She drew pictures that Emma framed and hung on the walls. She came up with the names for some of the dishes. Happiness soup for the chicken noodle, hug casserole for the lasagna, Grandma's love cookies for the chocolate chip cookies made from Maria's recipe. Will handled the business side. Permits, licenses, insurance, health inspections. He discovered that running a restaurant was 10 times more complicated than running a real estate company. But he didn't care. For the first time in his life, he was building something that mattered. Then in month 4, disaster struck. Will was at the restaurant site, watching the final touches being put on the kitchen, when his phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. Mr. Montgomery, this is Frank Morrison. Will frowned. I'm sorry, who? Frank Morrison. I own the building you're leasing. Portland Properties, LLC. I think we need to meet. An hour later, Will sat across from Frank Morrison in the man's downtown office. Frank was in his 60s, overweight, with a florid face and expensive suit that didn't quite fit right. Behind him on the wall hung photos of his restaurant empire. The Golden Fork. 5 locations across Portland. High-end, expensive, soulless. I'll get right to the point, Montgomery. Frank leaned back in his leather chair. I'm raising your rent. Will kept his face neutral. We have a 3-year lease at $4,500 a month. That was before I knew what you were planning. Frank smiled, and it wasn't friendly. A restaurant, in my building, competing with my establishments. We're not competing, we're serving completely different clientele. Doesn't matter. New rent is $12,000 a month. Starting next month. That's not legal. We have a contract. Read the fine print, Montgomery. Any substantial change in use of the property allows me to renegotiate terms. You're changing from retail to food service. That's substantial. Will felt cold rage building in his chest. You're trying to drive us out. I'm running a business, Frank shrugged. If you can't afford it, I have another tenant lined up. Golden Fork number 6. We'll fight this. Go ahead. My lawyers are better than yours. And while you're fighting, you won't be able to open. That space will sit empty. You'll lose your investment. He leaned forward. Or you can pay the $12,000. Your choice. Will stood up. I'll be in touch. He left the office, got in his car, and sat there for 10 minutes, gripping the steering wheel, trying not to put his fist through the dashboard. He called his lawyer. David, I need you to find a loophole, any loophole. The loophole came 3 days later. If Will could prove he had invested more than $100,000 in renovations, the lease terms were locked. No renegotiation allowed. The problem was he had spent exactly $95,000. Will looked at the numbers. He needed $5,000 more in renovations, but the restaurant was done. What else could he possibly add? Emma found him sitting in the empty restaurant at midnight, spreadsheets covering the table in front of him. Talk to me. He told her everything. About Frank Morrison, about the rent increase, about the $5,000 gap. Emma sat down across from him. So we need to spend $5,000 more? Yes, but there's nothing left to renovate. They sat in silence. Outside, rain poured down, drumming on the windows. Inside, the restaurant they had built together sat ready to open. But it might never get the chance. Then Emma smiled. I know what we need. What? A piano. Will blinked. What? My mother used to say that music makes food taste better. We put a piano in the corner. Live music on weekends. Local musicians who need the exposure. That's perfect. Will felt hope surge. We could get a decent used piano for around $5,000. They bought the piano the next day, installed it in the corner near the window. And when Will's lawyer presented the receipts to Frank Morrison, proving $103,000 in renovations, the man's face turned purple with rage. But the law was the law. The lease held at $4,500 a month. 2 weeks before opening, they hired staff. Emma insisted on interviewing everyone personally. She chose 2 young cooks, Carlos and Jenny, both fresh out of culinary school and eager to learn, 3 servers, all college students working their way through school, and a dishwasher named Mike, a military veteran who had been homeless until Will found him sleeping behind the building and offered him a job. Emma trained the kitchen staff herself, teaching them her mother's recipes. She was patient but demanding, making them redo dishes until they were perfect. This isn't just food, she told them. This is love. This is comfort. If we don't make people feel that, we've failed. The night before opening, Emma, Will, and Sophie sat in the empty restaurant. All the tables were set. The kitchen was stocked. The sign outside glowed in the darkness. Maria's kitchen. Tomorrow, people would come. Tomorrow, their dream would either succeed or fail. Tomorrow, everything would change. Sophie sat between Emma and Will, holding both their hands. Her voice was small in the quiet space. What if nobody comes? They'll come. Will squeezed her hand. They'll come because your mama makes magic. I'm terrified, Emma admitted. What if we fail? What if this was all for nothing? Will turned to look at her, the woman who had been working 16-hour days for 4 months, who had risked everything on a dream she barely believed in, who was braver than anyone he had ever known. We won't fail. And even if we do, it won't be for nothing, because you've already given me everything that matters. Emma's eyes filled with tears. You really believe that? I do. Sophie stood up on her chair and wrapped her arms around both of them. We're a family now, right? Will and Emma looked at each other over the little girl's head, and in that moment they both knew it was true. Yes, sweetheart, we're a family. Outside, the rain continued to fall. Inside, 3 people held on to each other and hoped for a miracle. Tomorrow, they would find out if miracles still happened in the world. Hashtag the last meal. Part 3, the Feast of Redemption. Opening day arrived with clear skies and cold wind, the kind of February morning where the sun shines bright but gives no warmth. Emma had been awake since 4, unable to sleep, finally giving up and going to the restaurant to start cooking. By 6, the kitchen was alive with activity. Pots bubbled on the stove. The oven radiated heat. The smell of roasting chicken and baking bread filled the air, spilling out into the street through the vents, announcing to the neighborhood that something new had been born. Will arrived at 7 with Sophie, who had insisted on wearing her best dress for the occasion. It was too small, bought from a thrift store 2 years ago, but she wore it with such pride that it might as well have been a ball gown. She carried a bouquet of daisies that Will had bought from the grocery store, gripping them tight in her small fists. For Mama, she announced, marching into the kitchen. Emma turned from the stove, her face flushed from the heat, her hair pulled back in a net, wearing the white chef's coat Will had bought her. She looked exhausted and terrified and absolutely beautiful. Sophie presented the flowers with great ceremony. Emma knelt down and took them, pulling her daughter into a tight hug. Thank you, baby. They're perfect. Are we going to have lots of customers today? Emma looked up at Will, who stood in the doorway. The question hung in the air between them, a question neither of them knew how to answer. I hope so, sweetheart. By 9:30, everything was ready. The dining room gleamed. Fresh flowers sat on each table. The chalkboard menu hung on the wall, each item written in Emma's careful handwriting. Grandma's pot roast, happiness soup, Sunday morning pancakes, hug casserole, and at the bottom, in larger letters, Grandma's love cookies. Carlos and Jenny stood ready in the kitchen, nervous energy making them fidget. The servers adjusted their aprons for the 100th time. Mike polished water glasses that were already spotless. Will stood at the window, looking out at the street. People walked past, bundled in coats against the cold. Some glanced at the new restaurant with mild curiosity. Most didn't look at all. 10 o'clock, time to open. Will unlocked the door and propped it open. Soft music played from the speakers. The smell of Emma's cooking wafted out onto the sidewalk. They stood there, all of them, waiting. Nobody came. 10:15. A couple in their 60s paused outside, reading the menu board. Emma held her breath, but they shook their heads and kept walking. Too expensive, the woman said to her husband, loud enough for everyone inside to hear. 10:30. 2 college students looked in, saw the prices, and left. We can get a burger for half that. 11 o'clock. 3 customers. An elderly man who ordered coffee and sat in the corner reading a newspaper. A woman with a laptop who wanted the Wi-Fi password. A teenager who used the bathroom and left without ordering anything. Emma stood in the kitchen doorway, watching the empty dining room. Her hands trembled. Will could see her fighting back tears. By noon, the lunch rush that should have filled every table had produced exactly 7 customers. 7 people in a restaurant built for 80. The sound of their conversations was swallowed by the vast emptiness of the room. Emma retreated to the kitchen. Will found her leaning against the walk-in refrigerator, her face buried in her hands. I told you, her voice was muffled. I told you this wouldn't work. It's the first day. We made $167, Will. $167. Do you know what our operating costs are for one day? $800. We lost over $600 in 6 hours. Give it time. Time? Emma looked up at him and her eyes were red. How much time? How many days can we afford to lose $600? You put everything into this, and I'm failing you. You're not failing anyone. Look around. Emma gestured to the empty dining room. Nobody wants this. Frank Morrison was right. People want fine dining or fast food. Nobody wants comfort food from some nobody who learned to cook from her dead mother. Will wanted to argue, wanted to tell her she was wrong, but the empty table spoke louder than any reassurance he could offer. Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway, still wearing her too small dress. She had been handing out menus to the few customers who came in, trying to help. Now she looked at her mother's tears and her small face crumpled. Did I do something wrong, Mama? No, baby. Emma wiped her eyes quickly. You didn't do anything wrong. Then why are you crying? I'm just tired. But Sophie saw through the lie the way children always do. She walked to her mother and wrapped her arms around Emma's waist. It's okay, Mama. Tomorrow more people will come. I know they will. Emma held her daughter and cried harder, trying to muffle the sound against Sophie's hair. Will turned away, giving them privacy, and walked back into the dining room. He stood there looking at the beautiful space they had created, the photographs on the walls, the flowers on the tables, the piano in the corner waiting for someone to play it. Had he been wrong? Had he let his need for family, for belonging, blind him to reality? Had he destroyed Emma's life instead of saving it? The door opened. Will turned, expecting another person who would look around and leave. Instead, he saw a figure he recognized. Mrs. Eleanor shuffled in, leaning heavily on a cane. She wore the same threadbare coat she had worn that Christmas Eve 3 months ago. Her face was weathered, her hands gnarled with age and hardship. But her eyes, when she looked around the restaurant, were bright. Sophie saw her and gasped, Mrs. Eleanor. The old woman smiled. Hello, sweet child. Emma came out of the kitchen, wiping her face. Mrs. Eleanor, what are you doing here? I heard about your restaurant. Mrs. Eleanor made her way slowly to a table near the window. I came to support you, the way your daughter supported me when I had nothing. Emma's voice shook. We can't accept payment from you. Not after everything. I have $15. Mrs. Eleanor pulled a small, worn purse from her coat. I saved it. I want to pay. Please. Emma came to the table and gently pushed the purse back. You're our guest, today and every day. Anything you want is free. Mrs. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. You're too kind. You were freezing and starving on Christmas Eve. My daughter gave you our last meal. Emma's voice grew stronger. This restaurant exists because of what happened to that night. You'll never pay here. Never. She looked at the servers. What would you like, Mrs. Eleanor? The old woman ordered the pot roast, the soup, and the cookies. Everything that Emma had made with her mother's recipes. When the food came, she ate slowly, savoring each bite. Tears ran down her weathered cheeks. Will watched from across the room as Mrs. Eleanor set down her fork and looked around at the handful of other customers. Then she stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. Excuse me. Her voice was thin, but it carried. Can I have everyone's attention? The 7 customers looked up. Emma emerged from the kitchen. Will moved closer. Mrs. Eleanor pointed at Emma. Do you see that woman? 3 months ago, on the coldest night of the year, I was sitting on the steps of an abandoned building. I had nothing. No food, no home, no hope. I was ready to give up. Her voice shook. Then this woman's daughter came to me, a little girl no more than 5 years old. She walked barefoot through the snow and gave me her dinner. The only food she had. She gave it to me and she smiled. Sophie, who had been standing near her mother, looked down at her feet, suddenly shy. That little girl saved my life. Mrs. Eleanor wiped her eyes, not just because of the food, but because she reminded me that there are still good people in this world, people who care about strangers, people who give without expecting anything back. She looked around at the other customers. This isn't just a restaurant. This is a place where people care, where food is made with love. I've eaten at fancy places. I've eaten at cheap places. But I've never tasted anything as good as what I just ate here, because every bite was made with a mother's love, with a family's heart. The room was silent. Then one of the customers, a middle-aged woman with a laptop, started clapping. Then another, then all of them, standing up, applauding. Emma covered her mouth with both hands. Sophie ran to her, and Emma scooped her up, holding her tight. Mrs. Eleanor sat back down and continued eating, a small, satisfied smile on her face. One of the customers, a young woman in her 30s, pulled out her phone. Will watched as she typed something, took a photo of her food, typed more. She was completely absorbed, her fingers flying over the screen. 20 minutes later, as Will was clearing tables, his own phone buzzed. A notification. Someone had tagged Maria's Kitchen on Instagram. He opened the app and found the post. The photo showed a bowl of happiness soup, steam rising from the golden broth. The caption made his throat tight. I came to Maria's kitchen today, expecting nothing special. I'm leaving in tears. Not because the food was bad, because it was so good it reminded me of my grandmother's cooking. Because the owner's story about her daughter giving away their last meal to a homeless woman reminded me why we gathered to eat in the first place. Food isn't just fuel. It's connection. It's humanity. It's love. This pot roast tastes like being wrapped in a warm blanket on a cold day. This soup feels like being hugged. If you want fancy, go somewhere else. If you want to feel something real, come here. 5 stars. No question. The post was signed Jessica Parker, Portland food blogger, 50,000 followers. Will showed Emma the phone. She read it, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. Within an hour, the post had been shared 300 times. Comments poured in, people tagging their friends, making plans to visit, sharing their own stories about comfort food and family memories. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, there was a line outside the door. By 5, every table was full and people were waiting. By 6, Emma was running out of food. The kitchen became controlled chaos. Emma shouted orders. Carlos and Jenny moved like dancers, chopping, stirring, plating. Mike washed dishes as fast as they came in, his tattooed arms moving in constant motion. Will helped serve tables. Sophie, still in her too-small dress, brought bread baskets to waiting customers. The dining room filled with the sounds of conversation, laughter, the clink of silverware on plates. A critic from Portland Monthly Magazine showed up without a reservation. Will seated her at the last available table and watched as she tasted Emma's pot roast. Her eyes closed. She made a note in her phone. Will couldn't read it, but her expression said everything. By 9 o'clock, when they finally locked the doors, the register showed $3,247 in revenue. Emma stood in the middle of the kitchen, surrounded by dirty pots and empty containers, and laughed. It was the laugh of someone who had survived falling off a cliff and found solid ground at the bottom. We did it. Will pulled her into his arms. You did it. Sophie ran in and hugged both their legs. Best day ever. They cleaned the kitchen together, all of them, working until past midnight. Mike swept the floors. The servers wiped down tables. Carlos and Jenny scrubbed pots while debating cooking techniques. Emma made a list of what she needed to prep for tomorrow. Will counted the register and made the deposit. And when everything was finally clean, they sat together at one of the tables, eating the food that hadn't sold. Simple plates of pasta and bread, but it tasted like victory. 3 days later, the first attack came. Emma arrived at 6 in the morning to find the restaurant's front window covered in graffiti, crude words sprayed in black paint, health code violations, rat nest. The letters dripped like blood. She called Will immediately. He arrived within 20 minutes and found her standing on the sidewalk, staring at the damage. Who would do this? Will had a good idea, but he kept it to himself. Call the police, file a report. I'll get someone to clean this. The graffiti was gone by noon, but the damage was done. Customers who walked past saw the workers scrubbing the window and turned away, suspicious. Then the health inspector showed up. Unannounced, unusual for a restaurant that had just passed inspection 2 weeks ago. The inspector was a thin man with cold eyes and a clipboard. He went through the kitchen with aggressive thoroughness, checking temperatures, examining surfaces, opening every container. He found mouse droppings in the corner behind the refrigerator. Emma stared at them. That's impossible. We clean every night. I was here until midnight. Nevertheless, the inspector made notes. I'm required to shut you down until you complete a full fumigation and pass re-inspection. How long will that take? At least 5 days. 5 days of lost revenue. 5 days of customers who would come to a locked door and might never return. 5 days that could kill all their momentum. After the inspector left, Will examined the corner where the droppings had been found. Something didn't feel right. He took photos with his phone, close-ups of the area. Then he went outside and checked the security camera he had installed above the back door. The footage showed a man in a black hoodie approaching the restaurant at 2 in the morning. He forced open the back window, the one that led to the kitchen. He was inside for less than 5 minutes. When he left, he carried a small bag. Will called a private investigator he had used before for business matters. By evening, he had a name. The man in the hoodie was an employee of the Golden Fork, Frank Morrison's restaurant. Will drove to the Golden Fork's flagship location downtown. It was everything Maria's kitchen wasn't. Cold modern decor, servers in crisp uniforms, customers in expensive clothes eating tiny portions of food arranged like art. He asked to see Frank Morrison and was led to a private office in the back. Frank sat behind a massive desk, swirling wine in a crystal glass. Well, Montgomery, come to surrender already? I know what you did. Frank smiled. I'm sure I don't know what you mean. I have video footage of your employee breaking into my restaurant, planting evidence, making false health code complaints. Do you? Frank sipped his wine. How unfortunate. I hope you plan to go to the police. I could, but I think the media would be more interested. Local restaurant owner sabotages small family business. The story would trend for weeks. Frank's smile faded. You have no proof connecting me to anything. Your employee, your company credit card. Will was bluffing about the credit card, but Frank's face told him he'd guessed right. I can prove it all. So prove it. Frank stood up. Take me down. But while you're fighting that battle, your restaurant stays closed. You lose a week of revenue. 2 weeks, your momentum dies, your customers forget about you, and by the time you win, if you win, it won't matter. You'll be bankrupt. Will felt rage building in his chest. The same rage he'd felt with Richard Sterling. The rage of watching people with power and money crush anyone who threatened them. But this time he didn't give in to it. Instead, he pulled out his phone and showed Frank the Instagram post from Jessica Parker. 50,000 followers, now 100,000 shares. You think you can destroy us with sabotage? Will's voice was quiet. You're right that I can't prove this in court. Not quickly enough, but I don't need to because our customers don't care about evidence. They care about stories. He typed something on his phone and showed it to Frank. A draft post. The truth about the Golden Fork. How a corporate restaurant chain is trying to destroy a family business through intimidation and sabotage. Because they're afraid of real competition. Because they know their expensive food can't compete with meals made with love. Don't you dare post that. Then leave us alone. We'll put his phone away. Call off your dogs. Stop the sabotage. Let us succeed or fail on our own merits. And if I don't, then I post this. And I call every food blogger, every restaurant critic, every local news station in Portland. I tell them everything. Your reputation will be destroyed long before mine is. The two men stared at each other across the desk. Finally, Frank sat back down. You're bluffing. Try me. Frank was quiet for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone and made a call. His voice was clipped, angry. Withdraw the complaint. Yes, the one from this morning. Do it now. He hung up and looked at Will. There, happy? I'll be happy when I never hear from you again. Will left without another word. By the time he got back to Maria's kitchen, the health inspector had already called. The complaint had been withdrawn. They could reopen immediately. But the damage had been done. 5 days closed. 5 days of customers who came to a locked door and might not come back. Emma was devastated. Will found her sitting in the dark restaurant, staring at nothing. We're finished. All that momentum, gone. We'll get it back. How? Emma's voice was empty. We can't afford another Instagram miracle. Will sat beside her. Then we create our own miracle. The next morning, Will called in every favor he had. He contacted food critics he'd met through business functions, restaurant reviewers, local television stations. He offered them something rare. Full access to Maria's kitchen, behind-the-scenes footage of Emma cooking, interviews about the restaurant's origin story. 2 television stations said yes. 1 food magazine, 3 major food bloggers. Emma cooked while cameras watched. She told the story of Christmas Eve, of Sophie giving away their last meal, of Will appearing in their lives, of Maria, the woman who had taught both of them that food made with love was the only kind worth making. The segments aired over the next week, the articles published, and slowly, steadily, customers returned. But this time they came for a different reason, not just because a food blogger had posted, but because they had seen Emma's face on television, heard her story, felt her passion. They came because they wanted to be part of something real. 3 weeks after reopening, Maria's kitchen had a wait list, 2-week advance reservations, lines out the door for any walk-in spots. Frank Morrison's flagship location closed 2 months later. Poor reviews, declining customers, a reputation tarnished by rumors of sabotage and corporate bullying that Will never confirmed but never denied. 6 months after opening day, on a warm evening in August, Will asked Emma to close the restaurant early. She protested, "It's Saturday night, our busiest night." "I know, but I need you to trust me," Emma agreed reluctantly. They sent the staff home after the lunch shift. Sophie was with a babysitter, a kind neighbor who sometimes watched her when Emma worked late. When the last employee left, Will locked the door. The dining room was quiet, empty. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, painting everything gold. "What's going on?" "Sit down, please." Emma sat at a table near the window. Will sat across from her, and his hands were shaking. 6 months ago, I watched your daughter give away her dinner to a stranger. and something inside me broke open. Something I'd kept locked away for most of my life. Emma started to speak, but Will held up his hand. Let me finish. Please, I need to say this. He took a deep breath. I spent 42 years building walls, protecting myself from being hurt again the way Maria's death hurt me. I built a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I married a woman I didn't love. I had everything money could buy and nothing that mattered. Then I met you and Sophie, and you let me in. You let me sit at your table and eat simple food and feel like part of something. You trusted me with your dreams. You let me help build this place. You gave me a family when I had nothing. Emma, I love you. Will's voice cracked. I love you and I love Sophie and I love this life we've built together. And I don't want to go back to my empty house and pretend I'm okay with being alone. I want to wake up every morning and see your face. I want to help Sophie with her homework. I want to grow old watching this restaurant succeed. He pulled a small box from his pocket and opened it. Inside was a ring. Simple. A single diamond on a gold band. Nothing flashy, just beautiful. I want to be your husband. I want to be Sophie's father. Not because you need my money or my help, but because I need you. Because you're my home. Emma, will you marry me? Tears streamed down Emma's face. She covered her mouth with both hands. Will waited, his heart hammering. Say something, please. You already are. What? Emma reached across the table and took his hands. You're already Sophie's father. In every way that matters. You read to her at night. You take her to school. You make her laugh. She loves you. And you? Will's voice was barely a whisper. I've loved you since the day you gave her that doll. Since you looked at my daughter with such kindness. Since you saw past our poverty and saw us. Is that a yes? Emma laughed through her tears. Yes. 1,000 times yes. Will slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. He had guessed her size from watching her hands for months, memorizing every detail. They stood and came together. The kiss was soft at first, then deeper. When they finally pulled apart, both were crying. The door rattled. They turned to see Sophie's face pressed against the glass, the babysitter standing behind her looking apologetic. Emma laughed and unlocked the door. Sophie ran in. Did he ask you, Mama? Did he? How did you know? Sophie grinned. He told me he was going to. I helped him pick the ring. Emma looked at Will. You involved my daughter in proposing to me? She has excellent taste. Sophie grabbed both their hands. So we're a real family now? Like, official? Official. Emma pulled her daughter close. We're a family. They stood there in the empty restaurant, holding on to each other as the afternoon light faded to evening. Outside, the city moved on. Cars passed. People walked by. The world kept turning. But inside Maria's kitchen, time stood still. 3 people who had found each other against all odds. 3 people who had built something beautiful from nothing. 3 people who had learned that family wasn't about blood or money or anything you could buy. It was about choosing to stay, choosing to love, choosing to show up every single day and say, you matter to me. 2 years later, on a cold December evening, Maria's kitchen was full to bursting. Every table occupied, every chair filled. The wait list was 3 weeks long. Food critics had called it the best comfort food restaurant in the Pacific Northwest. Reservations came from as far away as Seattle and San Francisco. But tonight they had closed to the public. Tonight was for family. Emma moved through the kitchen with practiced ease. Her movements fluid after 2 years of cooking in this space. She was 8 months pregnant, her belly round under her chef's coat, but she refused to slow down. Carlos and Jenny tried to make her rest. She waved them off. At the center table, pushed together with 5 others to make one long dining surface, sat 40 people, neighbors from the Heights. Mrs. Eleanor, who now lived in a small apartment Will had helped her find and worked part-time at the restaurant greeting customers. Mike, the dishwasher who had become assistant kitchen manager. The servers, past and present. Jessica Parker, the food blogger who had become a close friend. And at the head of the table, Sophie, now 7 years old, wearing a red dress and a smile that could light up the world. She stood on her chair and tapped a spoon against her glass. Everyone quieted. I want to make a toast, her voice was clear and confident, to my mom, who makes the best food in the whole world, to my dad, Will, who believed in us when nobody else did, and to baby brother who's coming soon. She held up her glass of apple cider, and to Grandma Maria, who I never met, but who taught us all that food made with love is the best kind of food. Merry Christmas, everyone. The room erupted in cheers, glasses clinked. People stood to hug each other. Will sat next to Emma, his arm around her shoulders, his hand resting on her pregnant belly. She leaned into him, tired but happy. Thank you, she whispered. For what? For everything, for believing in me, for loving Sophie, for giving us this life. Will kissed the top of her head. Thank you for letting me in. They watched as Sophie moved through the crowd, hugging people, laughing, completely at ease. She had grown so much in 2 years, more confident, more outgoing, but she still had that same heart, that same compassion that had started everything. Just last week, she had used her allowance to buy sandwiches for a homeless man outside the restaurant. When Emma asked her why, she had said simply, because he was hungry, Mama, like Mrs. Eleanor was hungry. The meal was served family style, huge platters of pot roast, mountains of mashed potatoes, bowls of vegetables, baskets of fresh bread, and for dessert, Maria's love cookies made from the recipe that had brought Will and Emma together. People ate and talked and laughed. Stories were shared, memories made. It was loud and chaotic and perfect. After dinner, after the dishes were cleared and the coffee served, Will stood. He had something to say. Thank you all for coming, his voice carried across the room. 2 years ago, this restaurant didn't exist. Emma and Sophie lived in a tiny apartment. I lived in an empty mansion. We were all lost in our own ways. He looked at Emma. Then, on Christmas Eve, I watched a little girl give away her last meal, and everything changed. Sophie beamed. This restaurant isn't just a business. It's a family. It's a community. It's proof that when people come together, when they choose love over fear, miracles happen. He pulled Emma to her feet. My wife taught me that. My daughter taught me that. And all of you have shown me that every single day since we opened. Will raised his glass to family, to love, to second chances, and to the people who remind us that kindness is never wasted. Everyone stood, to family, to love, to Maria's kitchen. The toast echoed through the room, and as Will pulled Emma close, as Sophie wrapped her arms around both of them, as their friends and family surrounded them with warmth and joy, he felt something he had never felt before. Complete. Not because he had money, not because he had success, but because he had found what he'd been searching for his entire life without knowing it. He had found home. Later, after the guests had gone and the restaurant was quiet, Will and Emma and Sophie sat at a table near the window. Outside, snow had begun to fall, big fat flakes that drifted down like blessings. Sophie yawned and leaned against Will's shoulder. Best Christmas ever, she murmured. Emma smiled and put her hand on her belly. The baby kicked, strong and insistent, as if agreeing. Will looked at the photograph of Maria Williams hanging on the wall, the woman who had loved him when no one else would, the woman who had taught Emma to cook, the woman who had brought them all together across time and death in impossible odds. Thank you, he whispered to the photograph. Thank you for everything. The snow fell harder, covering the city in white. Inside Maria's kitchen, a family sat together in the warm glow of Christmas lights. 3 people who had found each other in the darkness. 3 people who had built a life from nothing. 3 people who proved that love, real love, was the only wealth that mattered. And as they sat there, holding on to each other, the baby kicked again, a reminder that their family was still growing, that the story wasn't over. It was just beginning. Outside, the wind carried the smell of Emma's cooking through the streets. People walking home from late shifts or Christmas parties pitched in and breathed deep. Somewhere, they thought, someone is making a meal with love. Somewhere, somewhere, someone is home. And they were right. Inside Maria's kitchen, in the heart of Portland, in a restaurant built on kindness and cookies and the simple act of giving away a last meal, a family was home. Finally, truly, completely home. The lights stayed on late into the night. The snow continued to fall. And if you had walked past at just the right moment, you might have heard laughter. You might have seen through the window a little girl dancing, a pregnant woman smiling, a man who had everything and nothing finally understanding that he had found what he needed all along. Family, love, home. The things that money could never buy. The things that mattered most. The things worth living for. And in that moment, on that snowy Christmas night, with the world quiet and cold outside, Maria's kitchen glowed like a beacon. A reminder that kindness is never wasted. That love is the greatest gift. That sometimes giving away your last meal is how you find your way home. The end of one story. The beginning of forever. The end.